Let's hope that January really is an indicator of what your year is going to look like, because I read 15 books in January. 6 of those were audiobooks, 4 of those were ebooks, and the remaining 5 were physical books. I had a pretty standard reading month for myself. I think I mostly gave out 3 stars. I occasionally gave out a 4-star. Let's just jump right in. First, I read Siege and Storm, which is book 2 in the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and I enjoyed this one more than the first book. I think I have a full trilogy review up on the channel if you would like to go check that out, as well as a spoiler-filled ramble where I give more in-depth thoughts. I guess that goes for both Siege and Storm and Ruin and Rising. I read these back to back. Overall, I enjoyed them. I don't really have much to say in a quick format. I have plenty of thoughts over there in those videos. This was not anything life-changing or groundbreaking for myself, but I did enjoy my time, and each of these had me staying up till like 3 a.m. trying to finish them, so I think that's a good sign. Next, I read Piranesi by Suzanna, and this was one of my 4-star reads. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really well done in execution and intent. This is a sort of fantasy-inspired, Greek mythology-inspired labyrinth tale about a man who lives... Hi, hello, editing Rachel here. So I'm editing and realized that I lost a clip where I finished telling you about Piranesi, so I just wanted to pop on and let you know that this book is not really plot-based. It's more focused on the daily life of the man that lives in this house slash labyrinth, and kind of how he has learned to cope with his existence, as it's not a normal existence. He lives alone in this place, and there's one other man that he calls the Other who shows up occasionally. One day the Other tells him that there's someone else coming into the house slash labyrinth and that they are seeking to do harm to this man. There is a mystery that goes throughout the story that really kept me entertained, but it's not a very plot-focused story, so if you have trouble keeping focus, if there's not a lot of action, then this probably won't be the book for you, but I really enjoyed it, and I think it's worth a shot if any of these themes sound interesting to you. A Tale of Two Cities follows a father and a daughter and how their lives are impacted by the French Revolution, as they are French citizens living in England. This book is really a commentary on the French Revolution itself, on nobility versus peasant classes, and how everyone of different classes was affected by the French Revolution. What I love this book for, though, is none of that stuff. It is purely Sidney Carton and his journey to discover how he can be the best man that he can be, even though he spent most of his life being a trash bag of a person. If you love a great redemption arc, this is like the classic redemption arc of all redemption arcs, and you should totally check it out for that alone. It is Charles Dickens, though, and his writing is known for being excessively flowery because he got paid by the word, and so if you can push past that, I do recommend the audiobooks. That way you're not slogging through. It's actually quite lyrical to listen to, and I really enjoyed my time. The next book I read was The West End Game by Ellen Raskin, and this was a reread for me. The West End Game was a book that I read in middle school, and I remember loving it as a little 6th grader. And while I enjoyed my reread, I was definitely bothered by a lot of the racist caricatures that there is in this book, and the mystery itself wasn't that exciting. I remember it being a lot more interesting when I was younger, but it was still a fun middle grade nostalgia throwback read listen, since it was on audiobook for me. The next book I read was The Testaments by Margaret Atwood, and I loved this book. This book solidified Margaret Atwood as one of my favorite authors. If you don't know, The Testaments is the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, which is her dystopian look at what life would be like if a radical Christian group kind of took over the US government and set up a new regime where they control everything according to what they believe their biblical values are. I just love the way Margaret Atwood writes. What I've read from her is that her books start out very slow and methodical, and the purpose is to be very reflective and not action-packed whatsoever, but at the very end of her story, she kind of ramps up the energy and the expectations to where at the very end you're just on the edge of your seat and you can't wait to figure out what's going to happen next. This book follows 3 different women and their lives and how they're connected to this new Christian government of Gilead and how they're affected by the toxicity that is Gilead. This is a sequel that was written 35 years after the release of the original, so there's definitely a lot going on here, and I would recommend you read The Handmaid's Tale before you get into this, but I love Margaret Atwood, and this is like, it's like dystopian. Did I say that? It's just really, it's a good time. 4 stars. Did I say I gave it 4 stars? I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read In 5 Years by Rebecca Serle, and I don't remember what I gave this one. Pop here what star rating I gave it. In 5 Years is about a woman who, on the eve of her engagement, has a dream where she sees herself 5 years from now, and she is with a completely different man, engaged everything's completely different. Fast forward 4.5 years later, she actually ends up meeting this man that she had a dream about being engaged to, and he is dating her best friend. That kind of sets it up to be a kind of romance storyline. It's really, really not. This is more a tragedy, drama, contemporary than a romance of any sort and kind. I am not a huge fan of contemporary tragic dramas. I can't see past the melodrama a lot of times. I do think that if you enjoy this type of story, then you will be torn apart. There is an excellent friendship, two friends, best friend dynamic love story between them, not like actual romantic love, but their friendship relationship is what is the focus here and the exploration. And I think I cried maybe, but I didn't sob my eyes out like I have heard other people have. It's definitely not my type of story, but I think it was done pretty well. Not really well. I don't really know how I feel about this. The next book I read was A Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig. I think I'm saying that correctly. I looked up the pronunciation, but I'm probably butchering it. This is a First Nations dystopian own voices story about a First Nations tribe and how they cope with the apocalypse. Again, the focus of the story is not on what caused the apocalypse, but mainly how these characters and this tribe and these families survive in the middle of winter when their power is cut off, their internet is cut off, their electricity is cut off. It's a look at the depravity of man and the resiliency of man and the survival instincts, as well as kind of a love letter to First Nations traditions and their importance in maintaining in the cultural knowledge of its people today. I also really benefited from seeing a First Nations perspective and an own voices writer, as I am very ignorant on First Nations cultures of all kinds. I know they're highly varied. I enjoyed the story for what it was at its base and at its core, and I also enjoyed the story for what it taught me. I'd highly recommend this if you enjoy dystopian apocalypse survivalist stories. It reminded me of The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and while I'm not a huge fan of survivalist stories just in general, I did really enjoy my time, and I gave this book 4 stars. Next, I listened to The Silver Linings Playbook by Matthew Quick on audiobook. I enjoyed this movie a lot when it first came out and watched it several times. I think the acting was really well done, and I appreciate the portrayal of mental health in the film, so I wanted to see what the book was about. And they're pretty much very similar, although I would say that the movie focuses a lot more on the romance between our two main characters, and the book focuses a lot more on our main protagonist, the male. I don't remember his name. Why do I always forget characters' names? We're more focused on his journey to accept kind of the trauma of his past and how that affects his mental health and what life can look like, what his new normal is. I enjoyed it, and I think it's worthwhile, especially if you like these types of stories. I don't know if it is something that I would instantly pick up another Matthew Quick novel, but I did enjoy my time. I think I gave this book like 3 stars. Next, I read Circe by Madeline Miller, and I gave this book 4 stars, and I may bump that up to like 4.5. I don't know, I have mixed feelings. But when I was reading Circe, it gave me the inspiration for my isolated female trope video that I have up. Reading this book reintroduced me to my love for this character type of an isolated female. Circe has been exiled to an island where she must live alone throughout the rest of her eternal days because she is a goddess, nymph creature. She was exiled because she is a sorceress and she used her powers on her own kind, and she's kind of just being manipulated by the gods in her life, used as a bargaining chip. This is really a feminist novel in all aspects of the word. A lot of the conversation is centered around the way men use women and the way women can try and take their power back and how sometimes they're not always successful. The reason why I love this story though was just how completely heartbreaking it is. This isolated female character type, if you don't want to go watch that video, just a quick snippet, part of what characterizes them is their destiny for isolation, their destiny to be alone. They can form relationships and make connections, but they're always short-lived because they're meant to be alone for whatever purpose, whether it's their personality or their circumstances, and it's completely heartbreaking every time. And this was no exception. Circe broke my heart, and I cried at the end. The ending was very kind of, you can assume kind of the direction the author was trying to go in, but it's really left out into the open, and I cried. I haven't cried like that in a book in a really long time, and my husband was like, what is wrong with you? But I got so invested in Circe's story, and I really wanted a happy ending for her, and because the rest of the story was just heartbreaking. I don't necessarily recommend this for everyone because it is a slower paced novel, and it's not necessarily, it doesn't follow the similar structure of like rising action, climax, falling action. Instead, you have peak points throughout the story, and I called it like a peak and trough. Each section of the book kind of rises to one point of action, and then it falls, and then it rises again, and then it falls. Like it happened over and over again. There wasn't one big climax that we were moving towards. Definitely very unique and not something I've read a lot of, but I enjoyed it, and I think a lot of you will too if you give it a shot. Next, I read The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo, and this was an audiobook. It's a kind of self-help book on getting tidy and organizing, and it kind of goes along with the minimalism phase of things. If you've heard of the KonMari method, she got a Netflix show, all kinds of stuff. I went through my minimalism phase about 3 years ago, and I don't think I've gone back on that, but I know that there are definitely ways and places that I can improve my organization and my tidying as well as my kind of decluttering. So I wanted to see what the expert herself had to say, and I don't necessarily agree with all of the points that she raised. She at one point specifically said to get rid of your sweatpants and wear elegant nightwear, and I am not going to get rid of my sweatpants. I'm so sorry. Definitely just an okay audiobook, something to listen to while I'm working, and now I can say that I've read it, but that's really all I have to say. Next, I read Son of a Witch by Gregory Maguire, and this is the sequel to Wicked. If you did not know that Wicked the musical was based off of a book, and you did not know that there is a sequel, now you know. I haven't read Wicked in about 4 or 5 years, but I remember that it wrecked me. Wicked also falls into that isolated female character type, and Son of a Witch picks up immediately after the end of Wicked, and we are following Leigh, who is the supposed son of Elphaba. We're not really sure. It's never actually stated. It's kind of left up as a mystery on purpose, but we really follow Leigh in his attempts to find family, find purpose. He's really completely alone in the world, and he's kind of been given these tools to make something of himself, but he doesn't know if he wants to make something of himself. I struggle with Gregory Maguire's writing. It honestly puts me to sleep a lot of the time, but I'm really interested in the stories that he's telling, these retellings, the worlds that he's building out of classic stories and classic fairy tales. So I push through, but dang, sometimes it's difficult, especially kind of in the midway point and the beginning. It's a bit of a slog to get through, but the ending always ramps up to a good amount of action, and the side characters are a lot more entertaining to me than the main characters are. Specifically in this one, I loved Candle. I loved her. I wanted to protect her and make her happy, and it makes me sad what happened to her. I mean, it makes me sad where her story went, the direction that it went to. But it's definitely an interesting story. If you've ever wanted to know what happens to Oz after the Wicked Witch dies, like, this is kind of his take on that, and it's interesting for sure. These definitely go a lot more political than I think the original Wizard of Oz stories went, and they're definitely adult books. These are not books for children. These are not YA. They're not new adult. They are adult books. But if you're curious and want to know, I also just love sprayed edges. Like, look at that. And the first book, Wicked, has green sprayed edges. So, I mean, what else am I going to do? Next, I read Shadow Kiss by Richelle Mead, which is the 3rd book in the Vampire Academy series. It's not a trilogy, it's a series. I'm reading this as part of the Vampire Academy read-along, and this was not my favorite. I definitely did not like this as much as I liked book 2. I appreciated the extra elements of magic that were brought in and how they helped explore the grief and trauma of what happened in book 2. But I had serious problems with the relationship, and if you know anything about Vampire Academy, there is an age gap romance where it's super suspect because she's under the age of not being a minor anymore, and her love interest is not only someone who is older than her, but is someone who is her teacher and instructor. Book 3 takes it in a place that I was not comfortable with, and I know that there will be people that support it for whatever reason, but I just could not. My heat just kicked on. If that's background noise, get over it. I don't feel like turning it off, so it's okay. Just try to ignore it. It definitely set up book 4 to be a lot more exciting than the book 3 was, so I'm interested to see where it goes, and I will be picking the next one up next month, so just follow along with my journey on the Vampire Academy. Next, I read It by Stephen King. And I'm planning on filming after this a kind of discussion on it because I have a lot of thoughts and I don't know how I feel about it. I definitely have issues with Stephen King as an author. Definitely have issues with things that he did, particularly hypersexualization of an 11-year-old girl. That is problematic. I don't care what you were trying to say in your story. If you don't know, it follows the town of Derry and 7 children as they encounter a monster living underneath their town and killing people. At the same time, we're following these 6, 7 kids as they're adults and they're having to come back to Derry to kind of face their trauma and what happened when they were children. It is a classic and it is known as like one of the greatest horror stories of all time, and I don't think it deserves that praise. I can't do horror. Like, I can't watch horror. I can barely read it. I guess listening to it on audiobook made it better, but I wasn't even really scared while I was listening to it, partially because I knew where the story was going because I watched the movies, but I don't know if it really deserves the hype that it gets, and I definitely don't think it needed 1,200 pages to say what it said. The last book I read was Prince Caspian by C.S. Lewis, and I read this as part of my Chronicles of Narnia critique series, which I have taken a huge break from. My intention when starting a booktube channel was to focus on one series, do deep dives and discussions, and get really intense into one book series to hone my skills as a booktuber. Clearly took a very long break, got back into it with Prince Caspian to finish out my reading for the month. Prince Caspian was never one of my favorites growing up reading this Chronicles of Narnia series, and I think it's because it's definitely geared towards an older audience. Prince Caspian finds the 4 Pevensey siblings back in Narnia after hundreds of years have passed in Narnia time, but only 1 year has passed in Earth time. Caspian is the son of the true king, nephew to the usurper uncle, and he has taken it upon himself to regather old Narnia that's gone into hiding and try to form his kingdom and take back his throne. The Pevensies are called upon to help Caspian in his endeavor, and of course they succeed with Aslan's help. The reason why I feel like this story is geared towards an older audience is because there's a lot more grit and dirt in the Narnia world, in the form of battles and infighting, as well as kind of darker characters and themes compared to the other stories, not compared to like grimdark or anything. I have trouble with this book because there's a lot of walking around and traveling and meeting a bunch of random side characters that don't really matter, but I also really enjoy this one because we get to meet some of my favorite side characters ever, including Reepicheep and Trumpkin and a lot of fun characters. Also just love Caspian. I feel like he's kind of a himbo, but we can talk about that at another time. I am recording a in-depth critique / review for this book. Maybe tonight, maybe not. Just depends on how things go. Alright, that is everything that I read in the month of January, all 15 books. So I'm really hopeful that this bodes well for the rest of the year. I am definitely on track with my Goodreads goal of 100 books in the year. And in case you're curious what I'm starting February off with, because it's February 1st today when I'm recording this, Leviathan Wakes right there. Yeah, that's the first book I'm reading in February, and I'm loving it so far. I'm on page 250, and it's just a great time so far. So I am vlogging that experience. If you'd like to see that, make sure you subscribe. Otherwise, thank you guys for listening to me talk about the 15 books that I read in January. Let me know what books you read in January, or if you've read any of these books and disagree with my thoughts on them. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.